I found out my marriage was dying because my brother called me from my own backyard and asked whether my wife liked red wine or whiskey. And I know that sounds insane, but that was the exact moment my normal life split in half. I was standing in the kitchen with a grocery bag cutting into my fingers, rainwater dripping off my jacket, staring through the window at my younger brother Ryan's truck parked behind the fence where nobody visiting casually would ever leave it. And then my phone lit up with his name. The second I answered, I heard his low, nervous laugh and him saying, "Man, I'm trying to grab a bottle on the way in, and Claire is acting like this whole thing is some secret operation, so what does she want tonight?" I did not say anything for a second, because my brain simply refused to catch up with what my ears had heard. My wife had told me she was spending the evening helping her friend Melissa after a minor surgery, and I had left work early because the power went out at the warehouse, and I thought maybe I could surprise her with takeout and a quiet night. But instead, I was standing there listening to my brother casually talk like he had plans with my wife in my house. When I finally spoke, my own voice did not sound like mine. I said, "Ryan, I'm home right now, so you need to explain why your truck is in my yard and why you're talking about Claire like I'm not her husband." There was this dead, horrible silence on the line, the kind that feels alive because you can hear somebody panicking through the quiet. Then he muttered, "Michael, this is not what it looks like," which is such a ridiculous thing to say to a man who has not even told you what it looks like yet. And before I could answer, the back door opened and Claire stepped onto the porch wearing my college sweatshirt, holding her phone to her chest, scanning the yard with that irritated expression she always used when she got caught in a lie, but still felt entitled to be angry about it. She saw me through the glass, froze for half a second, then snapped into that smooth, fake composure I used to mistake for confidence. She opened the door and said, "Why are you home early? And why are you standing there looking at me like that?" And I remember laughing once, not because anything was funny, but because something inside me had already started breaking. I held up my phone so she could see Ryan's name still glowing on the screen, and I asked her, "You tell me, because apparently everybody has the schedule except me." She went pale, then defensive, then cold, all in a span of seconds, which somehow hurt worse than tears would have, because it told me lying to me was not new for her. It was practiced. She said Ryan was just stopping by, that I was twisting things, that I always made innocent situations ugly, and every word out of her mouth felt rehearsed, polished, ready. Then I heard my brother's truck door slam outside, and the sound hit me harder than shouting would have, because suddenly it was real in a way I could not explain away. In one ugly minute, I had gone from husband to outsider in my own home, and by the time Claire looked me in the eye and said, "If you are going to act crazy, that is on you," I realized the first thing I was losing was not even my marriage. It was my ability to recognize the woman I had been defending for 10 years. Ryan walked into my backyard like a man approaching a crime scene he already knew he was guilty of creating. And the strangest thing was that he kept trying to smile at me as if this was some awkward misunderstanding that could still be smoothed over with a casual explanation. I stepped outside before Claire could say another word, because the walls of that house suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else, and I remember the cold air hitting my face while my brother stood there shifting his weight like a teenager caught sneaking into a party. I looked at him and said, slowly enough that he could hear every ounce of disbelief in my voice, "You need to start talking right now, because a few minutes ago you called me asking what my wife likes to drink, and now you are standing in my yard like this is normal." Ryan rubbed his face and muttered something about a misunderstanding, but Claire stepped out behind me before he could finish and immediately took control of the moment with that sharp tone she always used when she wanted to dominate the conversation. She said, "This is exactly what I was afraid of, Michael, because you always assume the worst, and then you corner people until they look guilty, even when they have done nothing wrong." I turned toward her slowly, trying to process how someone could lie so smoothly while standing in the middle of evidence that contradicted every word coming out of her mouth. I told her, "You said you were helping Melissa tonight, and Ryan just admitted he was bringing alcohol here for you, so either you think I am stupid, or you think I will simply accept whatever story you invent?" Claire crossed her arms and rolled her eyes with that dramatic irritation she used whenever she wanted to paint herself as the reasonable one in the room. She said, "Melissa canceled. Ryan offered to stop by and help fix the loose cabinet door you keep ignoring. And the wine was just something he grabbed because you always complain that we never relax anymore." Listening to her felt like watching someone build a house out of sand while insisting it was made of concrete. Ryan finally spoke again, but instead of clearing anything up, he only made everything worse. He looked at me with this strange mixture of guilt and defensiveness and said, "Michael, I swear nothing is happening the way you think it is happening, and if you would just calm down, we could sit inside and explain everything." Something about the phrase "calm down" hit a nerve I did not even know I had, because suddenly I heard the past few months replaying in my head like a long list of warnings I had ignored. The late nights Claire blamed on work, the way Ryan had started dropping by more often when he knew I was on shift, the subtle tension that always appeared when the two of them were in the same room, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I looked at both of them standing there together in my yard, and realized the worst part was not even the possibility that they had betrayed me. The worst part was the quiet suspicion growing in my chest that this had been happening long enough for them to become comfortable with the lie, and that thought sat in my stomach like a weight I could not lift. What made everything spiral from suspicion into something darker was not a confession, not some dramatic reveal, but a small, careless detail that neither of them realized I had already noticed. Ryan's truck door was still open behind him, and from where I was standing I could see a familiar gray duffel bag sitting on the passenger seat, the same bag he used when he stayed overnight somewhere. I remember pointing toward it slowly and saying, with a calmness that honestly frightened even me, "Ryan, you do not bring an overnight bag to fix a cabinet door, so either I am losing my mind right now, or both of you think I am the kind of man who cannot see what is right in front of him." Ryan followed my finger with his eyes, and the moment he saw the bag, his shoulders dropped like a man whose last defense had collapsed. Claire immediately stepped between us and said, with sharp irritation rising in her voice, "You are turning a simple situation into a ridiculous interrogation, and I am not going to stand here while you accuse your own family of something disgusting." I remember looking at her and thinking how strange it was that the person who used to calm me down during difficult moments was now the one trying to convince me that my own instincts were irrational. I said to her slowly, "Claire, if this is truly innocent, then explain why Ryan called me thinking I was not home. Explain why his truck is hidden behind the fence. Explain why he brought an overnight bag. And explain why both of you look like people who just got caught doing something you cannot admit." She stared at me with a cold expression I had never seen before and replied, "You always want drama, Michael. And maybe that says more about you than it does about me." Ryan finally spoke again, and his voice carried a weight that made my stomach tighten because it sounded like the beginning of a truth he did not want to tell. He said, "Claire, maybe we should just tell him because this is not getting better." She turned toward him instantly with a glare that could have stopped traffic and said, in a low, tense voice, "You are not helping anything right now." The way she said it sounded less like fear and more like anger at him for losing control of a story they had probably rehearsed a dozen times. Standing there between them felt like being the last person to realize a secret that had been circulating around me for months. I could feel anger rising in my chest, but underneath that anger was something far worse, a quiet understanding forming piece by piece that the two people I trusted most were connected by something that had been hidden from me for longer than I wanted to imagine. And the terrifying part was that I was beginning to realize this moment was only the surface of something much deeper. The moment everything truly shattered was not when Ryan finally started speaking, but when my neighbor's porch light suddenly turned on and illuminated the three of us standing in my yard like actors frozen in the middle of a crime scene. That bright yellow light cut through the darkness, and for some reason it made the situation feel humiliating in a completely new way, because now it felt like the whole world could see the moment my life was falling apart. Ryan rubbed his face again and said in a strained voice, "Michael, This was never supposed to explode like this tonight, and I swear we were going to tell you eventually." Hearing the word eventually hit me like a punch to the chest, because it meant the lie had been living quietly inside my marriage long before I stumbled into it. Claire immediately snapped at him with a sharp whisper that was full of anger rather than regret. She said, "You are making this worse by talking like that." And then she turned toward me with that same cold composure and began building another explanation as if words alone could erase what was already obvious. She told me Ryan had been coming over for weeks because I had been distant, because my work schedule had turned our house into a place where she felt alone, because she needed someone to talk to, and Ryan happened to understand her frustrations better than I ever did. Listening to her talk felt surreal, because she spoke as if emotional betrayal was a reasonable response to my overtime shifts, as if loneliness somehow justified secrecy. I looked at Ryan and asked him directly, "How long has this been going on?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. He hesitated long enough for the silence itself to become an answer. Then he said quietly, "A few months," which felt like someone ripping a page out of my life and telling me it had already been rewritten without my permission. Claire immediately cut in again, and this time her tone carried irritation rather than guilt. She said, "It is not the dramatic affair you are imagining, Michael. It started as conversations and it got complicated, and you would understand that if you ever paid attention to how lonely this marriage became." The way she framed it turned my anger into something deeper and colder, because she was not apologizing. She was defending it. I remember laughing again, but this time it sounded hollow, even to my own ears. I told her, slowly and clearly, "You could have told me you were unhappy. You could have argued with me. You could have asked for counseling, but instead you built a secret relationship with my brother, and then tried to convince me I was crazy for noticing it." Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground, but Claire held her ground like someone who believed she was still winning the argument. Standing there, I realized something painful and irreversible. The woman I married was not just capable of betrayal, she was capable of defending it without shame, and that realization felt like losing something far more important than trust. It felt like losing the entire version of her that I thought I knew. I wish I could say I handled the next part with dignity, with calm logic, with the kind of composure people imagine they would have in a moment like that. But the truth is that standing there between my wife and my brother made something inside me unravel in a way I had never experienced before. I remember looking at Ryan and saying slowly, "You grew up in the same house as me. You watched me marry her. You stood next to me smiling in every wedding photo. And somehow you still decided that the one boundary that should never be crossed was just another line you could quietly step over." My voice was steady, but the anger underneath it felt like a storm barely contained. Ryan shook his head and said in a strained voice, "Michael, I never planned for any of this to happen, and if I could go back and stop it before it started, I honestly would, because every step of this felt wrong, even when we kept telling ourselves it was just conversations." Hearing him say that almost made me laugh again, because it sounded like a man trying to convince himself that betrayal could stay harmless if you called it something softer. Claire stepped forward again, and there was something almost defiant in the way she lifted her chin. She looked straight at me and said, "You are acting like the only victim here, but you have not been present in this marriage for a long time, Michael. And maybe if you had noticed how unhappy I was, none of this would have happened." I stared at her in disbelief and replied, "You think the problem here is that I worked overtime, not that you secretly built a relationship with my brother behind my back." She folded her arms and responded with cold certainty, "I think the problem is that you stopped listening years ago and now you want to pretend this betrayal appeared out of nowhere." Ryan suddenly raised his voice, not in anger but in panic, and said, "Claire, stop talking like that because this is already bad enough." But she did not stop. Instead, she looked at both of us and said something that completely changed the atmosphere of the night. She said, "Maybe we should stop pretending this is only about secrecy, because the truth is I have been thinking about leaving this marriage for months." Those words hit me harder than the affair itself. Betrayal was one thing, But hearing her calmly talk about walking away from 10 years of shared life like it was a delayed decision made my chest feel hollow. I stood there trying to process it, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting match could have been. And in that quiet moment, I realized something terrifying. I was no longer fighting to understand what happened. I was suddenly fighting to understand whether my marriage had already ended long before this night began. What happened next was the moment the entire situation crossed from painful into completely surreal. Because just as Claire finished saying she had been thinking about leaving the marriage, my phone started ringing again in my hand. I looked down expecting to see Ryan's name, but instead it was Melissa, the same friend Claire had supposedly been helping that night. I answered automatically, still staring at my wife, and Melissa's voice came through the speaker loud enough for everyone to hear. She said in a confused tone, "Michael, I just got a message from Claire asking me to tell you she was with me tonight if you asked, and I have absolutely no idea what is going on." For a second, nobody moved. The silence felt heavy and almost unreal, because the lie Claire had been using just minutes earlier had now collapsed in the most public way possible. I slowly lowered the phone and looked at Claire. Her expression changed in a way I will probably never forget. For the first time that entire night, the confidence drained out of her face, and something closer to panic appeared. She immediately tried to recover and said sharply, "Melissa misunderstood what I meant." But even she sounded less convincing than before. Ryan looked at her with disbelief and said quietly, "Claire, you told me Melissa knew about everything." She snapped back at him with irritation, because she was supposed to cover for me, not call him directly. That single sentence changed the atmosphere completely. It revealed something ugly that had been hiding beneath everything else. She had not only lied to me, she had built layers of lies involving other people just to keep the situation hidden. I felt something inside me shift at that moment. The anger was still there, but it was being replaced by something colder, something more distant. I looked at her and said slowly, "You did not just betray me with Ryan. You built an entire story to make sure I stayed in the dark while it happened." Ryan suddenly stepped back like the reality of the situation was finally crushing him. He looked at me and said in a strained voice, "Michael, I swear I did not realize how deep the lies had gotten." I answered him honestly, without raising my voice. I said, "That is the problem, Ryan. You knew enough to hide it, which means you knew exactly what you were doing." Claire tried one last time to regain control of the situation. She raised her voice and said, "Everyone is acting like I committed some unforgivable crime, but relationships are complicated and people grow apart." The calmness in her tone felt almost cruel. Standing there in the yard, I realized something painful but clear. The woman I had been defending in my mind for years was no longer someone I recognized, and whatever future I thought we had together was collapsing faster than I could process. The strange thing about betrayal is that the moment after the truth comes out does not explode the way people expect. There was no shouting anymore, no dramatic accusations flying across the yard. Instead, there was this heavy, suffocating quiet, where everyone seemed to realize that the damage had already been done, and there was nothing left to defend. I looked at Ryan first because, despite everything, part of me still needed to understand how my own brother had allowed things to reach this point. I said to him slowly, "Out of every person in the world, you were supposed to be the one who protected this family, not the one who helped tear it apart." Ryan stared at the ground and replied with a voice full of regret that sounded genuine but far too late to matter. He said, "I told myself it was temporary, that it was just emotional support, that I was helping her get through a rough period in the marriage. But the truth is, I kept stepping deeper into something I knew I had no right to be part of." Claire let out an impatient sigh, like she was tired of listening to the two of us talk about loyalty and responsibility. She said sharply, "You are both acting like this situation is only about betrayal when the real issue is that this marriage stopped working a long time ago." I turned toward her and said quietly, "Even if that were true, you had 1,000 honest ways to handle it that did not involve secrecy and deception." She shook her head and answered with cold certainty, Honesty would have only created a different kind of fight, and I was already exhausted from trying to make you understand how unhappy I had become. Hearing her speak so casually about the end of our marriage felt surreal. It was as if she had been living in a completely different reality for months while I was still believing in the life we built together. I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment Ryan admitted everything. I looked directly at both of them and said, "Did either of you ever stop and think about what this would do to me if it came out like this?" Ryan whispered, "Every day." But Claire simply shrugged and replied, "Sometimes people get hurt when relationships end, and that is just part of life." That answer landed harder than any insult could have. It revealed something I had been refusing to accept all night. She was not just defending what happened. She had already emotionally left the marriage long before I realized it was falling apart. And standing there in the quiet darkness of my own yard, I began to understand that the final decision about what came next was no longer something she controlled. I stood there for a long time after that, longer than anyone probably expected, because the strangest thing about the moment when your life falls apart is that your mind does not explode with anger the way people imagine. Instead, everything becomes quiet in a way that almost feels peaceful, like the storm finally moved through and left nothing but the wreckage behind. I remember looking at the house behind Claire, the same house we spent years building together piece by piece, and realizing that every memory attached to it suddenly felt different. I took a slow breath and said, with a calm voice that surprised even me, "I think the hardest part of this night is not the betrayal itself. It is realizing that both of you had months to think about what this would do to me, and neither of you stopped." Ryan tried to say something again, something about regret and how he never meant for things to go this far. But I raised my hand and stopped him because by that point, explanations felt like noise instead of answers. Claire looked at me with that same defensive expression she had been wearing all night and said, almost impatiently, "So what happens now, Michael? Because standing in the yard talking about it is not going to fix anything." The way she said it made something inside me finally settle into place. For hours I had been reacting to everything they said, chasing the truth, trying to understand how two people I trusted could stand in front of me like strangers. But in that moment, I realized something simple and painfully clear. I did not need to convince her that what she did was wrong, and I did not need my brother to explain his guilt. What I needed was distance from both of them, so I looked at her and said the words that quietly ended my marriage. I told her, "You do not need to worry about fixing anything tonight, because I am not staying in a relationship where loyalty became optional." Ryan looked up with shock and asked, "Are you saying you are done with both of us?" I answered honestly, because honesty suddenly felt like the only thing left that belonged to me. I said, "I am saying that trust is not something you rebuild with the same people who destroyed it." I walked back into the house after that conversation, packed a small bag, and left before either of them could turn the moment into another argument. The drive that night felt endless, but it also felt strangely clarifying. The man who walked out of that house was not the same man who walked into the kitchen earlier that evening. If there is anything I learned from this, it is that betrayal rarely arrives as a single moment. It builds slowly through silence, through small lies that grow bigger over time, through conversations that should have happened but never did. My advice to anyone reading this is simple. Pay attention to the quiet changes in your relationship, because ignoring them does not protect the love you built. Sometimes it only gives the betrayal more time to grow in the dark.